Good morning, and welcome to this panel on where we'll deliberate the topic on public-private partnerships and skills, investments on the demand side. If you want to participate in the global discussion on GESF, please use Twitter. The hashtag is #GESF. My name is Mithun Kamath. I'm the CEO of GEM Skills for Africa. So don't go by the name. They've got the name board wrong. So my name is Mithun Kamath. So, as is practice, before we before we go into the panel, we have to look at the micro innovation that's taking place on the ground and the participation of teachers and head teachers in that micro innovation. So I have to call a member from our STIR NGO to come onto the stage and share one micro innovation with us. Can you please join me in welcoming him?
Thank you, Mithun. Good morning, everybody. I think you're probably accustomed now to hearing from somebody from STIR at the beginning of each panel session. I'm James Townsend. I'm the program director for STIR. And I wanted to share with you an innovation that one of our teachers in Delhi, who worked in a government school in Delhi, a great woman called Preetu, actually developed, and it's related to skills. But it wasn't born out of a sort of desire initially to develop skills. Preetu actually was just facing severe resource constraints, did not have a library of books to help her students develop their reading. But in this resource constraint, she actually saw an opportunity to develop some skills. And she set in place a program with her students where they would actually become authors and publishers and create their own library. So she set up a whole scheme where some students would write books, others would act as the people who would design them, others would be the people who would actually be responsible for publishing them and printing them and actually working out how best to display them. In doing this, of course, developing in her students a lot of the skills that are needed in the workplace. So again, as I've been saying at the start of each of these panel discussions, as we get into the panel itself, please do keep in mind actually the role that teachers and head teachers can play in supporting skill development, especially working innovatively with some of the private sector partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good reminder for all of us that necessity drives innovation. And I think we need to enter the topic as well with that as a background, because skills, as I'm sure all of my panel members will agree, is a very critical issue today worldwide. More so for the labor market, because that is very globalized. So companies are no longer competing with companies within a country. They're competing with countries worldwide. So the type of skill sets that they are looking for is global in context. They have to be relevant for today, and they have to start productivity on the day that they join. However, that's not the scene. The labor market spends a lot of time and effort and money in retraining employees as they come in induction programs or through management training programs or leadership programs. So therefore, there's generally anywhere between 3 to 6 months of a lag time between somebody being recruited and actually getting productive on the job. So that's where the labor market is. While the supply side of it is largely currently, at least on the skill side, driven by government, though there is private participation, but largely driven by government, both from a frameworks, standards, as well as delivery perspective. So, and there's a complete mismatch between what is required by the industry as well as what is currently out there on the supply side. So that's what we will discuss with the panel today. We have a very distinguished panel with us. Let me introduce each one of them to you, starting from the person on my left. He's Mr. John Davis. He's the Vice President of Intel. He's from the United States. He's also the General Manager of the Intel World Ahead program. And I'm sure as we go along, we will hear quite a bit of that from you. We also have with us Piyush Gupta, who's the CEO of DBS Group Holdings and DBS Bank in Singapore. And Mr. Ahmed Saeed, who's the Managing Director and Head of the Public Sector Group for MENA for JP Morgan Chase from the UAE. And I also have with me Luis from Brazil, who is from our Global Education First initiative, who will represent the youth in this very critical discussion. So welcome all of you. Please join me in welcoming the panel. So first I'd like each panel member, starting with John, to give out your opening remarks on the topic. And please give a little more introduction about yourself.
Okay, so in Intel, I run a program called World Ahead. And what we try and do there is, I think it's really an embellishment of private-public partnerships in that it brings together a couple of areas. In most large companies, you see there's the corporate philanthropy side and there's the business side. And as you look at education transformation and skills, both of those come to bear, and they come to bear fairly synchronously. If you look at our corporate social responsibility, we put in many, many tens of millions of dollars a year. It's probably $1 billion over the last 10 years. And it does things like capacity building, like training teachers. About 12 million teachers have been through Intel Teach in 100 countries in the last decade. It trains about 1.5 million a year. They do science and engineering fairs. It touches about 7 million STEM students every single year in science and engineering contests, again, to build that love and skills for science and engineering. And that goes on, and you bring that into the equation. The other side of this is working with governments, building capacity and skills, and that tends to be around the ICT area, which is our business. And we treat that as a business side, but bring the corporate skills into this. So we're forever working with governments on education plans in K-12. Rugged computers make the computers feel more like a science lab or a physics lab or a biology or an art creativity, many different pieces of software and skills, because they need that creation side, not just the consumption side of computers. I want to create, I want to collaborate. So we bring that into it. We work with lots of governments on connectivity. Rural schools aren't as well connected as urban schools, particularly in emerging markets, but you can overcome that with IT architecture. Companies do that all the time. How do you make that happen? How do you train the teachers so the teachers can actually manage a classroom with a computer? The kids grew up with them, the teachers didn't in many cases. So the teachers feel confident they can create a lesson plan, or they can manage a classroom of 20 or 30 computers and put those together. So we try and work all of those skills, and at the same time you're working with content companies, publishers, and other areas to make sure that runs well on the platforms, that gets integrated. So you try and bring all of those pieces together in the K-12 so that you've got the collaboration skills, which people need in their jobs afterwards, the creation skills, as well as the I'm consuming knowledge skills, and you build that as kind of the real base foundation. That's the K-12 side of it, and do it in a way that the teachers are trained with our programs, Microsoft programs, GEMS programs, many other industry programs, to be capable of leading that. That's the K-12 side. The second side is really more the higher education, which I'll probably get into later maybe, and that's really more about affordability, and it brings together a lot of different government departments, different powers across government's departments so that universities and higher ed can be equipped with technology and capabilities as well.
Thank you so much, John. Piyush, your opening remarks.
Thank you for having me here. As Mithun said, I head up DBS Bank Group. We are Singapore headquartered. We are a commercial bank in about 15, 16 countries in the region. Employ about 20,000 people and hire about 4,000 or 5,000 people every year. So I guess that puts us in a fairly significant position to get a sense for the demand-supply issues with respect to the new labor force. I want to say a couple of things before I talk a little bit about what DBS is doing. First, I want to underline the case that on the back of technology, the nature of work and the nature of jobs is changing very, very fundamentally. In fact, the change is so dramatic that the entire edifice of work, jobs as we know it, is going to be completely modified in the next 5-10 years. If you look at different categories of jobs, you take blue-collar jobs. It's quite clear, 2 or 3 years ago, there were news items of Foxconn, who employs 1 million workers in China, is going to replace large numbers of them with robots. Honhai in China is doing the same thing. So robotics, coupled with 3D manufacturing, is really leading to a situation where you need less and less of skilled manufacturing type labor, less of blue-collar jobs. You're seeing equally a big shift and reduction in low-skilled jobs. I was at the opening of the new LNG terminal in Singapore last month. It's a massive facility. And I asked them, how many people do you have over here? They said we have a total workforce of 64. At any point in time, they're 18 on the facility. Why? Everything's automated. So you have technology and you have one person sitting in a control room who mans the whole thing. Cranes, ships, pipeline, oil spigots, everything. But what's perhaps most scary even is the nature of high-end white-collar jobs is also changing dramatically. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Watson, the IBM supercomputer. IBM, if you remember 10 years ago, they developed a machine called Big Blue, which won the World Chess Championship. So a couple of years ago, they developed this machine called Watson, which won Jeopardy, which many of you are familiar with. It's a television game. What's tricky about it is that the way the questions are asked in double negatives. So the computer's got to be trained to learn not only natural language, but has got to be trained to learn it and apply cognitive skills at an extremely high order of understanding, comprehension. Watson is also, apart from being able to learn, digest, and relate to natural language instructions, it is also cognitive, so it keeps improving every time. It teaches itself. They applied Watson in 2 areas, diagnostics. So today at Sloan Kettering, for any diagnostics related to cancer, oncologists first go to Watson. Watson's capacity to diagnose is far superior to any surgeon because Watson can go through every literature, every case study, everything in the world like this. And I can tell you exactly what the diagnosis of this is likely to be. We are working with Watson today in DBS on wealth management with the same thesis. A single private banker only knows so much in terms of what's happening around the world and how they can apply it to clients. Watson reads everything, has a complete update on every asset class, gold, China, soybean, palm, what have you, and can apply it intelligently to every customer situation. So the level of advice is extraordinarily good. Why am I telling you all this? All of this leads to one really important conclusion, that if blue collar, if low skill, if high skill, if white collar is all going to be automated and changed, then that has profound implication on the nature of work, the nature of jobs, and therefore the nature of talent that we need to be building, developing, and embracing for the world of tomorrow. One of the things we believe in our case is that you're going to see increasingly is a golden age of entrepreneurship. You'll find less and less people engaged in working in companies and organizations, and more people driving their own capacities, small entrepreneurial activities, a lot of low-level, low-end, different kinds of entrepreneurship, because technology changes the nature of your ability to do big business with small resources and small base. If you think about what it means in terms of talent and skills, and quite clearly there's one set of talent and skills which is to do with technology. I tell kids these days, if you remember the movie Graduate in the 60s, and somebody was asked, so, career advice, and they use one word, plastics. The plastics was the future. Well, the one word I use today is computer science, because 10 years from now, you either know how to run the machines or you work for the machines. It's, 2 ways. So technology is a given. But technology is not all. There are other kinds of talents and skills. So cognitive ability. the ability to continue to synthesize and learn. I thought President Clinton said it well yesterday. How do you connect the dots? How do you synthesize and put things together? That's a skill set which is unique. It's a lot more than just knowledge. You can Google anything you want. It's synthesis, it's cognitive capability to put and to keep learning and to keep improving. It is the whole notion of being collaborative, of being flexible, of being interdisciplinary. The skill set of intellectual humility, the recognition that you won't know it all. So to recognize failure is great. If you're willing and you know how to fail, and then to leverage from other people's failures and pull stuff together, I think that will drive a whole bunch of different possibilities of success. So the kind of skill sets you're talking about are fundamentally quite different from the kind of skill sets that we focused on in the past. So how do you go about doing this? There are obviously two schools. You can, yesterday, Jeffrey Canada talked about the fact that, do what the rich do. So rich send their kids to college, you better send your kids to college. I think there is some relevance in that, because I think colleges at their roots still today give you broad perspective, especially if you have a broad liberal school education. Your ability to synthesize, interdisciplinary, connect the dots gets greatly enhanced. Right? At the same time, most college education today does not give you enough hard skills. So tech skills, quantitative skills, the skills that you really need in relevant workplaces. Your alternative is vocational. So you go through vocational training. You tend to get better and more specific work skills that keep you job ready and industry ready, but you tend to miss out on a lot of the interdisciplinary stuff, the soft stuff. And you then have this big stigma about not having had a college education when you go through that process. So how do you get something which is a little bit different and blends both of them together? Frankly, somebody talked about it yesterday. I think the German model is quite instructive. Germany has a youth unemployment rate which is the lowest in Europe today, 5%. Their model of apprenticeship, of doing more focused education but more hands-on apprenticeship, working, job situation, practicums, curriculums, is I think quite interesting. Now in Singapore, we do something of the same sort. We have two categories, the Institutes of Technology, ITEs, and we have polytechnics. About 70% of our high school population goes to the ITEs and polytechnics, focused on building different kinds of skill sets. Either the lower end technical skill sets around precision engineering or wafer manufacturing, or to the polytechnics, some slightly higher ended skill sets which are more semi-professional, hospitality, etc. Nevertheless, both of these professions still tend to be stigmatized. They're not college education. One of the things that we focused on in DBS, the two broad themes we focused on. One is, how do you work with the professional education schemes, ITEs and polytechnics, and then impart to them a degree of the soft stuff that they lack? So we have similar to what you said, Mithun, we have a 3-month program, 12-week program. We work with ITEs. Similar program we run with polytechnics, but our whole focus with them is purely soft skill development, professional skills development, around a whole range of analytics, innovative thinking, communications, customer rapport, working with teams. I try to bring to them the gaps that you get from a purely vocational education. We do a similar 10, 12-week exercise with the universities. We do it with the Shanghai Fudan University in Shanghai. We do it with the National Taiwan University in Taiwan. We do it with schools in Singapore. But there the focus is a little bit different. There the focus is to give them hard skills. So we have banking programs, banking practicums, banking curriculum programs based on case studies, but based on actual internships. We mentor them, we give them stuff, we bring them to the bank, we work actively with them. So they actually develop a whole host of working skills to make them more banking ready. At the end of this 10, 12-week program, in both cases, we offer people the opportunity of employment with DBS. So the whole agenda we're trying to drive is an agenda of trying to make kids from both ends of the spectrum fill in the gaps that they have, but try and get them to be more ready even when they come and join us. After that, of course, we do what Mithun suggested. We have internship programs in the bank, which then further work with them over the next 3-6 months, in some cases even a couple of years. So that's one whole school. Another big agenda we have is we have decided to champion the cause of social enterprises, social entrepreneurship. And that goes back to the comment I made earlier. We're convinced that enterprises and entrepreneurship is going to be crucial to the world of tomorrow. In fact, we think the whole issue around income inequity, the 99% 1% issue, cannot be left just to the state or to the governments. Our private sector is going to have to play a massive role in addressing that. Our thinking is if we can try and create a construct where we can help to teach people to be entrepreneurs, that learning and the learning to be able to do and run business on your own in a sustainable way is going to be invaluable. So we have 4-pillar exercise. One, we work on trying to create an ecosystem for social entrepreneurship and social enterprise across Asia. We work with different institutions, college, universities, etc. to do that. Second, we work directly with social enterprises. We work with about 70 or 80 of them today, helping them build their own human resource capacities as well as funding capacities, funding needs. Third, we engage with our 20,000 employees to actually participate in a voluntary way and create packages for social enterprises. So we have a social enterprise banking package, for example, which is significantly subsidized to help people enable and get capital and funds to be able to do some stuff by themselves. And finally, we just embarked on creating a capital exchange for social enterprises. But the whole intent is to put learning into action so you can create a situation where what we think will be the jobs of the future get some impetus and head start. Perhaps I'll stop there, Mithun.
Thank you, Piyush. So I think John has raised a critical point about the World Ahead program and how it is developing skills both at the K-12 level as well as a higher level, higher education level, and how it is feeding back into Intel's own requirements. And Piyush raised a very, very significant point about how the entire workplace is changing because of technology. And when you look back at our current educational frameworks and qualification frameworks, I mean, you can see how disjointed they are from what he's saying. But we'll talk about that a little later. We'll first hear out Ahmed.
Okay, thank you. If I can just, Piyush, just comment first, because I really loved the way that you laid out the set of very large and tectonic issues which are changing the nature of work, and then sort of married it to your specific firm and how you're reacting. So I'm just going to comment on a couple of the themes you raised, which were similar to the comments that I was going to make, and then tie it back to what we're trying to do at JP Morgan. And I think you're absolutely right. The nature of work in developed economies, in developing economies everywhere is fundamentally changing. And one of the things that's creating is a really, really significant disconnect, which hasn't historically existed between the supply side of education and the demand side of education. So we have systems, we have educational processes and systems which have functioned quite well over a multi-decade period, primarily in developed economies, increasingly in emerging economies, but they're built off of an old model of work and an old set of ideas about what skills are relevant and how one trains to be successful in these environments. That's all changing in the face of some incredibly powerful forces. And we talked about innovation arising from the schools. That's a critical part of it. But what's also critical is that those who employ and those who leverage skills to create productivity, they've got to be a part of this process. So I think one of the important themes for JP Morgan, and I can hear it in what you're talking about, clearly your institution is doing the same, sounds like Intel is doing the same, is we've got to be more deeply involved, we've got to be more deeply engaged in the educational and skills development process. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to comment on. The second is I absolutely agree that one of the most, there are two ways to think about the world, and they have been for the longest time. There's sort of a Malthusian, everything is going to go down the tubes perspective, and there's another that change always represents opportunity. The kind of innovation we see from companies like Intel is the function of a very, very small ecosystem that employs the resources and skills and potential of an incredibly small percentage of the human population. As these ecosystems proliferate, as these modes of training people to be critical, to marry hard skills with soft skills proliferate, there's absolutely no reason to be anything but incredibly optimistic about the potential for innovation to make a huge difference across the world, and to believe that we are merely scratching the surface of the potential of entrepreneurship. So I think that's a very, very important theme. Just to jump sort of to the end, I think from JP Morgan's perspective, we confront as an organization, as a global organization, I think two different sets of issues which are quite similar, but they're different in how they manifest themselves around this gap between the types of workers who are emerging from educational systems and the types of workers we need. In developed markets, there's really a structural shift in the nature of unemployment, which has created, a group of workers who are well along in their careers, but who now, between a combination of being expensive and now not being as relevant from the workforce, are displaced and are having a very, very difficult time getting reintegrated. And that represents a certain kind of challenge. And in emerging markets, you have a similar challenge around the gap between skills and demands, but it's not concentrated in the middle place of the labor force. It's actually concentrated primarily in the groups who are beginning to enter the labor force. From our firm's perspective, one of actually the most significant and important and certainly financially large initiative that we made through our foundation is an initiative that's concentrated in Western Europe and the United States, which we've committed $250 million to try to be a change agent within the space of developing skills for mid-career workers, for creating a better match between the supply side and the demand side, better policies, better clearinghouses, better training systems. It's a really, really important initiative for us because we do think that the world is changing. Ultimately, we both have an obligation to be a participant in this process, but it's also an opportunity for organizations like ours. In emerging markets where we as an organization have less scale, we try to come to those programs through partners who are focused on these sorts of initiatives. And in this region in particular, for example, we fund a number of initiatives focused on training young people as they enter the workforce. So I'll just pause there, but I think the issues are very large, they're very significant, they are being driven by incredibly important and powerful forces, and both the public sector, the private sector, we all have an obligation and an opportunity in partnering to develop skills and to move forward together.
Thanks, Ahmed. I think you've raised two significant points which we'll debate as we go along. One, I think, is when you said that the necessity of organizations like yours to participate in the process of education and skills development. I think that's the core or the crux of what we are trying to discuss today. And the second point is about massification. I mean, today, though there are programs running, but as you rightly pointed out, the impact of that might be quite limited compared to the scale of the issues that we have at hand. So how do we take all of this and then massify it? I think is another thing that we'll discuss as we go along. But first, let's hear out our friend from Brazil.
Thank you. I also would like before to comment some points that you talked about. I think more than anyone, we, the youth, are experienced these changes of understanding work and market and all of these things. But one thing that I would like to bring for the discussion is a point that my friend and colleague from also the Youth Advocacy Group for the UN Global Education First Initiative said yesterday in his panel, is that who is saying which skills are now important. Because one of the things that was wrong or is changing in the education is what we consider important. Because it was, like you said, it was taught for a market that is changing too. So we'll continue saying what people has to study based on what enterprise wants from them or what we as the society expect from them as citizens, as persons, as people. Well, talking about my work in Brazil, I work in Amazon with riverside communities trying to bring a sustainable development there. And for almost 3 years now, we have been working only from the demand side. And in every consultation, in every debate, in every discussion that we organized there, people was always talking about education and about schools. People in Amazon has to travel every day, have more than 3, 4, 5 hours to go to school and then to come back home. And it was only in the end of 2012 that we accepted the responsibility, the challenge, and decided to build a school. And this was only possible because of private and public partnership. And what I learned from this experience is that the public sector role and the private sector role don't exclude each other, not at all. Actually, they add to each other's roles. Because in one hand, we have governments worried about the 102 million students out of school. And in Brazil, there are 3.8 million students out of school. And in the other hand, we have big companies committed with innovation, with continued improvement. I mean, in one hand, we have the public sector worried about access to education. And in the other hand, we have the private sector able to redefine what quality education is. And we have a lot of examples in the world nowadays showing this. But what I would really like to highlight here today is that this should not be a partnership only between the public and the private sector. It should also be a partnership with the society. We have to engage the local communities in the discussion to create a real change. And I say this because in Brazil we have a lot of public and private partnership going on just to improve some companies' images and some politicians' images. And in the end, they not only have a worse image with the community, but they lost a big and real opportunity to change something. Only with the society engaged, the projects and the changes will be sustainable, will be for a lifetime. Because in the school we built, back to the school we built in the Amazon, we have the government sending teachers, guaranteeing access to education. We have companies who invested on our project, guaranteeing a certain quality of education. But in the end of the day, it's the local community engaged who keeps our school alive. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. I think your point about involvement of the community is well taken. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's at the core of most of the programs that are run by corporates. So, but I think I still want to ask you a question, whether you think the youth are left out of this dialogue. I mean, let's go back to what Piyush said in the beginning, that is the changes that are taking place in the workplace. Are youth aware that these are the type of skill sets they will need to acquire over a period of time? Is there a process of dialogue or is there a process of communication that's there to do this?
Well, I think I don't see a real dialogue with the youth. We can see it every day in every process. The youth, I think youth is participating more, but because youth is taking the front of it. Like we start talking about what we really want and saying no for something. Like, no, we are not doing this way. We don't believe in these ways. So today we have big companies with young people in front of them as the CEOs and high positions inside, creating this new world, this new market. So I think the youth is getting there, but from our side, because the society was not always very receptive for us. It was like, no, you have to study more, you have to do more things, so you can be in the same place that we are, and then we can talk about it. So now we are saying, no, we can do these things, and we are getting there, I think.
Okay.
Actually, in point of fact, the opportunities to directly engage with the youth have expanded and increased manifold because of technology and because of social networks. So let me give you 2 examples of things that we started doing in recent years, which we found very productive. So we had to design a new branch, and I wanted to make this like an Apple store, so make it a very different kind of branch. So we decided to run a social competition, and we put it out on Facebook and the social media and so on, and invited all kids from schools, engineering schools, architecture, design schools, etc., to participate in co-creating a branch concept. We got hundreds of entries with very creative thinking. We chose a short list of teams, and then we worked with them to say, hey, this is how we are thinking about the future, what you might want to think about. We finally got a couple of people who worked on this thing. We chose a project, and we hired the kids from the school to come and build the branch for us. So just one example of how you can start actually directly engaging students so they get a better appreciation of what is it that you as a company are thinking about and looking for. We did another similar, we've tied up with a scientific research organization called A-STAR in Singapore for doing applied research. But between that and bringing the research to market, we found an opportunity to engage with a couple of universities, so Nanyang Technology University, and we worked with the design classes university so they could sit with the scientists and work with us to see how you could take this research and actually put a design packaging around it. In both cases, I was struck by the fact that for the kids, the opportunity to really engage with the company help shape the thinking for what do companies really look for and want. So I do think we should be thinking a lot about the new media and how you can leverage it constructively.
Excellent, excellent. So I'd like really the panel to focus on two issues, and I think I'll go one by one, and I'd like each of you to comment on this. That is, one of the biggest arguments against public-private partnership has been that private sector is very inward-looking. That is, it's very profit-centered and typically looks at what it wants rather than the larger cause, which is why the government needs to take on the larger role and run it. So that's one. The second is that initiatives that are largely been done in the private sector are limited in scale and therefore have not been massified. And that again doesn't help. So what are the operational mechanisms do you think that need to be put in place so that we are able to scale what we do to impact a much, much larger number of the youth? These are two things that I'd like each of you to comment on here.
Okay.
Starting with John. Yeah.
So let me go to numbers specifically. I spoke earlier about teacher training, where 12 million teachers have been for our teacher program, Intel Teach, and the capacity in about 100 countries is about 1.5 million a year. Now that number can be as big as the government wishes it to be because we train master trainers, we enable them, but it's in the fundamental skills of I can create a lesson plan and I can collaborate with other teachers and I can collaborate across my classroom. And I think those are some of the skills that are going to be needed in that collaboration and that creativity. So I'm talking about millions here, and 1.5 million teachers a year trained in this trains tens of millions of students in that fundamental skill. So that's one area. I'll give you a second one. Everyone at this event I've been in has talked about the lack and dearth of people in STEM. We don't have enough STEM graduates. There aren't enough around the world. So we have a program there that we started in 1999. It's called Intel Science and Engineering Foundation. And what it does is it actually goes out to the communities. It's in 70 countries in the world. And locally, they have science and engineering contests. Science, engineering, mathematics, medicines in this. We spend we spend tens of millions of dollars on this every year. There's scholarships. And it's actually 7 million in the countries. They then go into national areas where they have their national contests. The winners of them go into the US. These are students that are 16, 17 years old, pre-university, and the idea of it is the love and the creation and the invention of mathematics and science and engineering. So 7 million a year. Now, in that 15 years it's been running, the second theme here is about females and their participation. 46% have been girls since 1999, and if you look at the number today, it's around 50%. It's half and a half. So it's boys and girls that's solving the second theme of this. So you're talking about millions, but they talk to their friends. They do the innovations. You're talking about a number of 7 million a year that gets into those kind of skills about the innovation, the creation, and to show you the kind of standards there, the last couple of winners have been in the medical field in terms of vaccinations, inoculations. They've been in earth sciences, planet sciences, very advanced mathematical theories. And of the winners that go to the US, about half of what they do gets patented by them. So it becomes an invention, an innovation. So you're talking about some big numbers there. Now, that number of both teachers and university and pre-university students there is a private-driven deal, but it can't be done without local governments organising the teacher training. They run the teachers, they do the capacitation of the teachers, they take the programs, they run the local science contests. The ministers of education and technology and innovation get behind these, they drive these. And so you've got privately initiated programs that basically cooperate beautifully with the governments across many ministries in the governments to make them scale, so they're in the millions and millions of numbers. And I think those are the kind of programs we need more of, because when you're reaching millions, and there's a lot of private companies that can do this. Microsoft does very similar, Cisco does numbers like this. This is where you get scale across many, many countries, and it's private and it's public, and it is a partnership.
Thank you, John. Piyush, your comments on?
Well, I think the first, the timing is propitious. Historically, companies have been internally focused. I think, Friedman in the 70s went on record and said the only social purpose of a corporation is to make money for its shareholders. I think the world has changed. I think the recognition that you move from shareholder value to stakeholder value is, and frankly, the crisis in the last 5 years has helped underline that. But I think that's taking root quite strongly. I think increasingly corporations, the private sector is beginning to recognize that you get the opportunity to run business only from by permission from civil society. These points are absolutely spot on. We get a license in countries to operate from the government, but if you don't get a license from the community and civil society, you can't operate. So you have to earn that license from civil society, which means that whether it is employees, customers, community, society, you have to take into involvement a whole range of different interests. So I think the timing is good to be able to encourage and broaden the whole private and public sector cooperation and partnership. With respect to your second question, how do you massify and scale? I think network impact and network effects are extraordinarily important. And I go back to party technology. Social networks today are just so vibrant and so easily accessible that we have to think about that as an opportunity to do things differently. So one of the things that you can do is create broader industry networks. In the financial industry in Singapore, we've collaborated across the entire industry, including with the central bank, to create something called a competency standards. We defined competency standards for all kinds of job categories and classes in financial services, including insurance, banking, etc. We drove the competency standards to levels of granular detail. Then we created a network of over 250 different education providers, practitioners, and we roped them in and certified them in being able to deliver and create programs which match those competency standards. So now suddenly you have an ecosystem of 200 banks and 300 education providers, and instead of one person trying to massify your 500 different interests and entities, all trying to participate in creating broad-based competencies which are relevant for the work program and workforce. The technology lets you do that today a lot more simply and a lot more efficiently than you could ever do in the past. And therefore, thinking creatively about network effects and technologies, I think, is the way to go.
Okay.
Maybe just, if I can add a couple of comments to this. First, I think that on the first point around the line between public and private sector and where they should meet, I think there has been a bit of a false dichotomy. The line between where public responsibility ends and private responsibility begins has always been an ambiguous one. Take the simple issue of training. Every company trains its employees.
True.
Whether that's apprenticeship or very specific skills training. It doesn't simply take from the public system, and those employees then are transitory. They move to other companies, they do other things. And so I think even historically that line has not been a hard one. I think as we're in a world which is changing very quickly, the importance of a very active feedback loop between the demand and the supply side becomes critically important. So that already ambiguous line, I think, is now the source of is at the center of tremendous change and flux. And so it's even more important today that the public and the private sector speak to each other, communicate, and react to what each other is doing so that the skills that are developed are relevant. And then the public sector takes it forward from there. So I think, I would say on that line between public and private sector, I don't think it has ever been, and I think it is even less so today, a harsh division. On the issue of scaling, I think there is always a collective action problem when you have a number of disparate actors who provide a good which doesn't accrue to them, whether that's at the level of individuals, whether that's at the level of organizations, and those organizations can be for-profit or non-profit. I think the nature of the underlying problem is very, very similar. In the case of the private sector, you solve that really through both formalized and informal structures for cooperation. And it does require leadership from larger organizations that have more at stake, and it requires participation from all of the key stakeholders. And I think we're seeing, in varying degrees, that sort of cooperation happen around the world in different frameworks and different organizations. I think, the organizations you're talking about working with the central bank are one example of that. I think frameworks and environments like this, which are tremendously important for information sharing, knowledge sharing, Sharing best practices are a very, very important part of that ecosystem. And I think governments are absolutely at the heart of that ecosystem, because they are, this goes back, to, social contract. They are the vehicle through which we express ourselves as a group. And so I think those would be my two comments. I think there's a number of different ways that we move towards scaling. And I think the line between public and private is a very, very dynamic place right now.
Yeah. Okay. Any comments from your end? Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to comment about the technology issue because I haven't talked really about it. I totally agree that technology is a key point in the in the education process, in the new education process, in the new society. But I would also like to say that it's not because we can use social media to participate in some things that it put us in the same point. For example, who said that we want to participate in a process just tweeting, or we want, like you example, send project, we want to participate in the process of taking decisions. We want to be in the same table and discuss from equal to equal, and because in the end we are talking about our future, like our society. This next years we will be in the same. I hope we'll be all equals actually, and yeah, that's.
We'll still be older.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Probably be dead.
We'll be lucky if we're just.
So I think we all hear what the panel is saying. I think they're saying that the private sector is actively, already doing work and is actively looking at expanding what they're doing, and it is not necessarily inward-looking. They're also saying the use of technology and the bringing together of various stakeholders into the process is extremely critical to expand, the public-private partnership. But do you think today there is a choice in this? I mean, do you think is it up for debate whether we need to do public-private partnership, or I think, is it a necessity? I mean, do we need to just act on it and start moving?
I think it's
Particularly for developing economies like Africa or Asia.
It's required. I don't think there's any choice in this. The government has ways of massifying things, and you have an innovation that comes along from the private sector, and it's a case of putting the two of them together. Now, what we do is we have a lot of our employees around the world. We have about 200 business development managers that only work with governments on programs like this. They're not paid to sell chips or to market areas. They're paid to work with governments on massifying these type of programs. That's exactly their job. So in our view, we made that decision a decade ago. The private-public partnerships was needed and put the people in place with the incentives to do this. And I think many companies have done that. Some of them have formalized it, some maybe less formal, but I think it's required and people are doing it. And the key issue is scaling it up. I think there was a very eloquent way of how the skills requirement are changing so quickly. Can we scale this up quick enough to meet those needs of changing skills in the workplace?
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
On what Mr. David said? I totally agree with you that there's no choice anymore, including because of the innovation you said. It's really clear that how enterprises are committed with innovation, and on the other hand, we have the government with more and more bureaucracy. So there's some things that it's so hard to do through the government that there's no choice for the companies and to take a step aside and say, no, it's not my problem. Because I think it's in the best interest of all the companies and big enterprise to have a qualified market, a qualified society, a qualified employees. So I totally agree with Mr. Davis.
Piyush, any quick comments?
Well, I think I talked about the fact there's an opportunity today. Technology lets you do things you couldn't do previously, so it's obviously a great opportunity to do stuff. But I also think there's a huge threat, and the threat is that I'm convinced in the next 10 years is going to see the most massive change in the social fabric and the social scheme of things that we've ever seen. And that's just because of this whole inequity issue. I was struck, if anybody's reread the Karl Marx recently, he was prescient when he said that capitalism has in itself the seeds of its own destruction because of concentration of wealth. I think you're beginning to see shades of that, and therefore thinking proactively about this issue of jobs, work, and redistributive economics is going to be the most pressing challenge of our times. To leave that to the state and the public sector is going to be impossible. The public sector, apart from having processes and being bureaucratic, doesn't have the resources. Therefore, it is for our own survival that the private sector has got to step up. It's not just an opportunity, you've got to deal with the threat.
Kamath, any comments from you?
No, I think the key points.
Okay, how about? So before I throw open the floor to the audience, I have just one final question to ask the panel. That is, what is your advice to government to bring in more private sector participation, more investments into this whole aspects of skills development? What are the one or two things you think they should do quickly to take the things forward? Let's start from Ahmed and then work back.
I mean, I think it's extremely context dependent because different countries find themselves in different situations with very, very different private sectors and different needs. But I think that I would come back to a point I made earlier, which is given how dramatic changes are in the nature of work, the importance for frameworks to enhance the feedback loop, for governments to be able to hear what the private sector needs and to think actively about how they adjust what they're doing. And it's not just employers as stakeholders, it's the youth and others as stakeholders as well. So government needs to take the initiative to get access to the information that it needs, and that information resides in various places.
Yeah.
So frameworks for information sharing and cooperation, I think, are particularly important today.
Okay.
An orchestra conductor role is how I would define it. You need people to orchestrate platforms. And governments are best positioned to be able to orchestrate platforms. The Singapore government just recently set up a committee called Aspire, which is focused on how do you take these ITEs and polytechnics and so on, and try to shape the education and learning in them to be more industry ready. But then they brought in the private sector, they brought in schools and the universities themselves, and you can then create a platform for dialogue, so you can help shape the discussion. I think governments should be doing that.
Okay.
Some of our very, very best programs that I've seen that reach tremendous amounts of people have actually reached across many, many groups in the government. So our education programs, if you used to try and get a laptop to every student in Senegal 1 or 2 years ago, you'd reach about 5% of them on affordability. But we've done programs there where you can reach 60 and 70 and 80% of them easily by getting enormous amounts out the cost of ownership. But what you've got to do is reach across the ministers of education who care about this. You need the technology side because that's where the skills come in. You'll find that there's enormous amounts of the costs come in the technology, in the connectivity in the areas. You're working with the Ministry of IT, the regulators, the Universal Service Fund, and you're working in some areas with ministries of finance on loan guarantees so that people can afford these and actually get going. So our best education programs around the world, and some of the most massive ones, have touched the Minister of Education, the Minister of Telecom and the regulators there, sometimes the Minister of Finance, and very occasionally the President and head of the country gets involved in this. And it touches all of them, and that's why we had to put these biz dev people in place, because you're reaching across many, many different groups in the government. And what I've seen is the ones that have worked the best is someone becomes, I think someone said, a ringleader, an orchestra leader. Those are the ones that work by far the best. And it's almost irrelevant what department in the government they come from, as long as they reach across all of them, cooperate with the private industry, pull the right pieces in, and you know who's driving this, who's leading it, who's got the plan, who's got the orchestra, and everyone plays their role in this one. And I've seen those work much, much better than the ones where you have to work through 15 different stovepipes. They're impossible.
Exactly. So I think the government really needs to play the role of a facilitator, bring all the stakeholders together, dialogue with them, and get them going. So with that, I will throw open the floor to the audience. If you have specific questions, because of the paucity of time, because I'd like to cover as many people as possible, just keep it short and brief, please. Yes, sir.
I have 3 questions to 3 of the panelists. See, I'm a doctor, basically. I'm chairman of 7 Palm Group of Hospital. Well, finance alone cannot help the problem of education as in health, which has been demonstrated by the development in East Asian countries. Countries having the equal amount of the capacity of expenditure have lagged behind in the attainment of the primary health care. See the question, the countries in East Asia and India at the time of independence have almost the same rates of infant mortality and life expectancy. India has lagged behind, whereas the other East Asian countries have gone ahead. Why? So gentlemen, the same is applied in education also. Second very big question I'm putting on technology, what we are telling too. Technology, gentlemen, helps only to the level the people have education. How technology can play a role in India, in Chapra district, where people literacy rate is very low. So please, for God's sake, don't rely heavily on technology. There should not be dichotomy, I don't say. There should be synthesis by technology, but not fully reliance on technology, because technology spoils at the times. We have to give stress on informal sort of education also. Lastly, don't leave it to private sector alone, for God's sake. I've seen the education in private sector. The best brains in the world, the whole of the medical science have come from the government institutions in a survey recently conducted. Why, you can ask me? You get the real perspective society. All private institutions have individualistic the fervor or the bent of the mind. Whereas, apart from education, there are many things to be taken into account in total development of individual, medically, I tell you. So, what I will suggest, there should be a public-private partnership, no doubt, but the policy should be dictated by the public, not the private. The moment you land in private, I'm running a hospital private, or motive, you know. If there's a patient of a cardiac care come to a private hospital, the surgeon there, the doctors there will have their start there. First day, the private motive, let me tell you very frankly. And the moment it leads to a government hospital like All India Institute of Medical Science, I've worked in the premier institute of the country. I know, the moment it comes, I try to put all my effort to save a patient, irrespective of what I get.
Okay, sure. I will ask the panel to comment on.
So please take it. These are my views. It should not be left only to the private sector. The policy should be dictated by the public. Public first should be in the pyramid.
Yeah. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with you on that. Yeah. The way to look at it is the government has to decide the what, the policy, what I'm trying to accomplish. And you'll find the private sector is going to be fairly innovative on the how to make it happen. And that's where the partnership comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah, the private sector comes, but let me tell again in the way private sector comes, that is not to be, you cannot accept as a whole, as we have seen in the medical science. Even in education, I quote you examples, how the things have deteriorated. It's like that. In Jharkhand, a state, a very backward state in India, which spends a lot of money on education. The moment they open the private groups, they prefer a class. They do not go near Charvaha. How did Lali Jadhav, people may laugh, but he brought a concept of Charvaha Vidyalaya in Bihar. Yes, it is needed. There are people who cannot go on the door of the public schools. They are afraid of. How can you expect a grazer man going to the door of, in England, it may be all right from America, but for India and developing country, let me tell you, you cannot solely depend on the private sector. There should be synthesis, but you cannot give, and lastly I tell you, I don't know what about your countries, but India, we have got a very good system, and that your country should follow. We are earmarked 2% of the profitability for the education and health. You know, under CSR, corporate social responsibility. So that budget is there. Society should dictate what should be the priority. And the private can play as a role as a facilitator. But the leader will be the public, not the private. That I want to say.
So I think the panel basically agrees with what you're saying. I don't think there is a large disagreement with what you're saying. Yes, I'll take that question there. Here.
Thank you, dear Global Compact. First, I want to salute the panelists for stepping up and stepping forward in investing in education. And I have obviously one comment, just very briefly, allow me. business, of course, is part of society, so it's not either or and public-private, but it's very integral. The issue for global business then is how to go local everywhere, and that's where sustainability and long-term orientation and the proactive approach is so important. But my question to the panelists really is, it's really inspiring, the examples some of you projected, but the issue of scalability and massification, the truth is also that only a small share of companies are truly proactive on public policy issues such as education. Not enough companies, I would claim, are really taking education as a priority. So the question is really how to win over the 95% of the private sector actors out there which are not embracing long-term investment in education. Because behind everything you said was a true intention of building long-term human resource capacities and skills, and it requires a long-term view in making such commitments. So my question to the panelists is, what can be done to win over those 90% of the corporate world that are still sitting on a fence and basically just waiting for taking the advantages and not willing to invest in the long term? What can we do to massify by bringing many more companies making education a priority?
That's a good question. Anybody would like to answer that?
I'll give you one comment on locally. In some of the cases, you look at things like teacher assessment. You see an Intel, a Cisco, a Microsoft working closely with UNESCO, maybe a GEMS in that. And big companies can do that on global. But if you want to massify this, it has to work with local companies. It has to work with local in there. So it's the local software, the local integration, the local platform build, the local support, the local service in here. And then for local companies to do that, they're typically going to be smaller companies and working in one or fewer number of countries than the big multinationals. There has to be a business for them, and they have to see that as not just if you're a small company, it's easy to say social responsibility, but you're in there for business if you're a tiny local company. So we have to make that profitable for them and easy for them. The big companies can do that, but also the governments in the local areas can make it profitable as well. It's their companies, it builds their jobs, it builds their capacity, and it solves some of the skills challenges as well, because it's in your country.
And to add to that, I'll just come to you in a second. To add to that, I think again, necessity drives many of these things. So in Kenya, we have a consortium of 47 construction companies of various sizes and this one who have come together and said that every construction project they will outline 5% or 7% of the budget outlay to skills development because it serves their needs. So I think it's a trend that is catching on.
I'd say basically, in other words, two things. One, I think we talked about before, companies can do with prodding and incentives. So what you referred to, in India, they've got this thing about 2% of this thing has got to be devoted to education. So if you're going to put 2% education by law, then by definition, you look for the right ways to make an impact. So prodding helps. But I think what Mithun said is correct as well. I think increasingly, you had the right thing. I mean, we're all part of society. We're not different from society. We're not different from the public sector. Our own interests and agendas are as much driven by what society expects of us as anything else. And I think that wave is upon us.
Yeah, there's a question at the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. May I sincerely congratulate the panel and thank them for their insight into the skills development. I think what we are discussing here is skills development at a more senior age. But I'm Minister of Education in Trinidad, and I'm looking forward to development of more students in the areas of technical and vocational education training in our schools. What incentives do we use, and how do we bring the private sector in terms of technical skills development into the education system? John Davies is doing a lot of work in Intel. Do we use a combination of IT for the students in the schools together with some hands-on training of skills development? Do we take these students out of the schools and take them into the workplace and train them there? What do you all recommend? I know India is trying to train by 2020 or 2025 500 million citizens, and China is also doing a lot of work. But we have a situation where a number of our students are not strongly academic-minded, But if you put them into technical vocational education, they feel that they are misplaced and they're looked at as a different type of student. How do we make them feel comforted? How do we get them to become more energized in technical and vocational education training and skills development from a younger age in the schools? Thank you.
Yeah, I think part of that is exactly your point, that in countries we do need a rich area of vocational education. I'll give you a couple of examples where I've seen this very well. In China, they have close to 50 million vocational education students at any point in time. I think about 30 million of them are in the tech colleges, the 2-year tech colleges, and about 20 million of them are actually in the schools of 16 and so years old. Now what they do there is, this is a bit limiting in some ways, but they line up with industries. It's the food industry, the beverage industry. These aren't manufacturing jobs. I'm making, plimp soles and clothes. They're actually training to use the tech and the machinery and the capabilities for the industries, the food industry, the beverage industry, the textiles, the high-tech industry. They look at where they go. The industry equips those tech colleges in China. I've been to many of them. These are like 10,000 student-sized colleges, and they have about a 99% employment rate out of them. They'll very proudly tell you that, and you'll see the way that happens. Now, that may not be quite, you're focusing on an industry, but I've seen that happen beautifully. If I go to a very tiny country like Armenia, and you'll go into the tech universities there, you'll find the #1 employer there is Synopsys in CAD/CAM. Look at the university courses there, and you see Synopsys written over many, many of them. That way they get their employees, they get them trained. So I think that kind of mindset is absolutely critical in it. You go into the Philippines, you'll see Hanna-Barbera and the animation, and historically they used to just do the drawing there. Well, now they have the Master of Arts in creation and design, so they're doing the design in those colleges, and it's given them the skills, the tech skills or the work-related skills that they're going to need in their job industry. Now, it is a bit limiting, so you need that foundation of creativity and collaboration, which is applicable to many of them, but I think more tech colleges and more work industry working with those to get the right courses and areas in there rather than just general education, I think it's going to be needed more and more and more to solve some of these problems. And I've seen it work in some places, and it works quite well, at least in the limited number of places I've seen. I'd go to the basic skills there of the critical thinking, the collaboration, the creation is going to be applicable to everything here.
No, well, just to add to what John is saying, that's an increasing trend worldwide. That is to include technical and vocational education training in mainstream education. So we are doing that in many parts of Africa in coordination with government. So we have to work with government on that score, because the government defines the curriculum for general education. So you include that vocational streams inside those. And those curriculum are driven from the occupational standards, again created from the private sector. So so it's an integrated process which we can of course discuss offline as we do it. Because we're out of time, I'm sorry I can't take any more questions. I think we're just the zero has been there long time ago. So please join me in thanking the panel. I think they've been very, very insightful and very practical. Thank you so much.